Thank you, Jen. This is the work that Chen has conducted over 1 year at the AA in the year that just finished with Diploma. The claim that one of the major players is, of course, a colonial system, is what you alert us to. And then the question on how to take that as one of the elements of the fine balancing that we've been discussing about institutionalizing, allowing, say, space for self-expression and independence and democratic and human rights. So suddenly the entire picture starts becoming again more and more complex and a mess. We see hyper-industrialization, neo-colonial systems of construction creeping in from all sides. And the moment that Greenland starts being more independent, it loses the support structures and the braces of also social braces, in spite of the disastrous conditions that Greenlandic have been suffering from Denmark, and it exposes itself from a new colonial system, not operating at the national level, not operating at the even at the international level, but operating locally through corporations that are transnational. And probably this showing again how difficult it is, and poses at least an initial question if we have the courage to be thinking the difficulties of operating independently. What does it mean to operate independently in the moment when independence brings you at the say, mercy of other colonial forces, and how to build capacity through probably an oblique look into the conditions that are shaping the ground. So this is where I sense we are at the moment. I would like really to start the discussion maybe by a short recollection of the things that we've heard. And we started with possibilities of having a view from two places at once, being an individual's subjective representations, you constantly repeated, but at the same time, the perspective is not that onto, let's say, a landscape. It's a perspective from above. It's trying to look at processes in their entirety, in their relationship as a coherent system, somehow cohesive, even spatially. And then we saw how that conceptualization of change brings about a clear investment and also, again, to use the word courage, to propose alternative cartographies. So the usual image that we have of the North as being subject to pressures is probably from above, can be tamed and can be contained in a different way by somehow moderating the space. And that moderation is then facing, in the work of Marianne, as I sense it, the difficulties of aligning an institution both to the complex field conditions. Suddenly you have to move from Africa to Iceland. Doesn't matter. The processes that you're looking at are very similar, and you need to reconceptualize probably the potentials of remoteness. That's what I sense. How to think remoteness not as being disconnected, so it's the opposite of the cohesive bodies that Philippe is looking at, but remoteness as being almost a solipsistic, individualistic, almost self-referential circuit. And then again, the difficulties of thinking an architecture of cohabitation when cohabitation is less and less based on large numbers, but basically being always exposed almost to the winds of the south. What happens when the large corporations or the military organizations, the Red Army and the NATO, start operating in those landscapes? For instance, in Tromsø and in the higher latitudes of Norway, immediately you are exposed to those geopolitical conditions. So the potential of looking at things from above and encounters the condition of subjectivity, and trying to work on remoteness and disconnectedness encounters circulations of the global. And I think those are exactly the reasons why we then invest, say this evening, in trying to probably start a reconstruction of what it means to operate in the 21st century. And Ijen's proposition that we might have to use colonial systems for another purpose could be interesting. So I wanted to basically open the discussion maybe by asking Philippe, how do you see that particular condition where, which I think is a symmetrical condition between geography and architecture, both disciplines trying to conceive of themselves as the cross paths of that have an overview. Architecture has the overview of the construction processes, and geography has the overview of economical and social and cultural processes. What's going on?
How many hours do we have?
We have 20 minutes.
We've been speaking this afternoon. It was really interesting on the meeting between different disciplines, like how a geographer can analyze space or territories, and architect has a view, maybe a very narrow view on just a building, disregarding the whole context. And this is, of course, very important. If you have an idea of the context, if you understand what's the context, either it's a large scale or very small scale. It's the opposite in geography. You maybe will not build the building the same way with the understanding. And this is probably the paradox. And it's valid everywhere, especially in the Arctic, but I think everywhere. And you were let's speak about image, because you were speaking about this and giving an image. That this is okay to try to find a new image to represent this area, very complex, and to give an alternative view of it. It's not impossible, it's possible, but the first thing is not to jump on the sheet of paper and to draw. The first thing is to try to understand what's the processes, the ongoing processes in there. And for understanding this, we have to look a little bit into history, into the economy, into the ongoing things. We were speaking about colonization. This is interesting because finally what Denmark has done in Greenland is exactly what Israel is doing in Palestinian occupied territory, what France has done in Algeria at that time. The way they behave, the way they do, the way they consider the let's call indigenous people, the people which are local communities, as something different as a human community, actually, because otherwise they wouldn't behave the way. And today we are trying to go towards looking at those local communities and to make some agreements to give them more autonomy or independence or more power to decide in which environment they want to live and what they want to do with their tourism and things. But there is a huge paradox, if not a schizophrenia. All those communities, whether or we like it or not, they are under, I don't know how you say this in English, guardianship still of the states, including guardianship of states which are supposed to have close to perfect governance, such as Norway, for example. I'm very amazed to see how Norway, Finland, and Sweden has really put a lot of energy to try to build a relationship with the Sami community in all the three countries. opening parliaments in all the 3 countries. You have a Sami parliament, you have discussions. On the paper, it looks like they have a pretty powerful saying way. But in the reality, they don't decide anything because NATO is still having a huge training course disregarding the problem it could mean for the grazing, for the things, and they don't really listen to it. And if you go to Canada, in the Inuit, it looks like on the paper they have no power at all, but not a single multinational corporations would dare to go ahead on the project if the local communities are not agree on this. But the agreements are done on a bilateral way and from objects. So there is here a paradox. Understanding this and understanding the status of the real power of those, I will put it into a bracket, colonized local community, because this is what it is the first step before we do everything in terms of mapping and photographing them. When I was in Greenland with some professional photographers which were aware and knowing pretty well the story of Greenland, the people of Greenland, and they were looking around with a photo camera, and they said, this view, this house, this sign here, which shows, and the way the sign is damaged, explain it all. I'll take this picture. And they framed it. They chose the elements to tell the story. They didn't shoot by complete coincidence as anybody would do. And so it was really natural for me. All those pictures, this is what it is, what I have seen. This is what, it's not, they actually didn't shoot what they have seen. They have shot the elements they thought were telling the story of Greenland in their understanding. So even the pictures is actually an element of manipulation, this question. So there is here something very important to try to go ahead, because this is the objective also, this enormous challenge to try to go ahead there with understanding what is the setup, what is how the societies there, the local communities are organized. And I want to finish with the use of territory. And one of the students used this word that I like very much, how you produce a territory, because this is what it is, and especially the Arctic communities. It's interesting to see your little film, because it shows an helicopter showing a white space. Actually, this white space, you could find it everywhere, or a green space even on the forest in France. You could drive even for 30 minutes without seeing anything else than vegetation or nature. But even though those spaces are looking like totally desert and not used, they are actually used. If you have less than 1 people by square kilometer in a huge area, this area could be completely overpopulated. If this sounds strange to you, we have to refer to the concept of what is an overpopulated area. An overpopulated area is an area which is not able to give resources and food to the people which lives on it. And if 1 square kilometers of an Arctic area is unable to give enough food to 1 person, if you find 1.5% there, it's already overpopulated. And then, this is why in the Inuit community, I have to speak about Inuit because I know them more than, or the Sami from the Kola Peninsula before they were ethnic cleansed from the Russian side, or in the northern side. But in Canada, it's even more brilliant. The use of territory could be hundreds of square kilometers around. The hunting tracks, the fishing tracks. And it looks like completely empty, but everything in this space is not of a coincidence, it's totally organized. But it's where we use 1 square kilometer, and Inuit have to use maybe 100 square kilometer. And what looks like desert is a completely organized space for the needs, well-known needs of the local communities there.
Can you say that what looks like desert is in reality a produced image as well? Exactly like the local population produce the territory, we produce the image of that space as being empty.
There is something important I forgot to say. It's on top of that. It's a produced territory already. It's, of course, not everywhere. You have some complete virgin territories. I'm not saying it's completely totally organized like in our country. But it's the knowledge of it. I was also in Africa when I studied in Burkina Faso, and then I was there for a few months, and we received some people who came in Africa for first time, and they wanted to see fields, how you make agriculture. They were interested by it. We took them by the car and driving 50 kilometers, and after 50 kilometers they said, "No, okay, enough, we want to see the fields." I said, "Yeah, sorry, you are crossing fields since 50 kilometers, haven't you seen them?" They haven't seen anything, because in the passage of the dry periods, the fields look like the savannah, and the savannah looks like the field. There is a melting. We knew it because we had the knowledge as geographers and students, but they didn't know it because they didn't have the knowledge, and it's the same thing. When you arrive in a place, if you don't have this very subtle knowledge to understand how the space is organized, of course, this it will not work. So, on addition of that, there is a question of knowledge of cultures and things, and this is really important, especially if you want to refer to it and to, as a journalist or as people, which is an in between the audience and the facts, to be witness of something.
So we need to increase knowledge. In the last 60 years, the Arctic and subarctic, and I think it's not by chance that, for instance, the United Nations has as its symbol an Arctic projection of the world, a polar projection of with the Arctic at the center. The way by which we conceived of the increase of knowledge was through a very strange notion of escalation, which is a particular way to understand the military connotations of how we perceive that world. Escalation is not just a possibility to escalate or a phenomenon of escalation. Everything starts growing. It's a knowledge production system. It's obviously related to the work of Herman Kahn and the Rand Corporation, and it basically tries to understand what happens when the phenomenon that you are experiencing brings in an intensification and an expansion, both of its internal system. He was looking at the possibility of thinking war, especially thermonuclear war. So what happens when a conflict escalates, you bring in more and more intensity and expansion, but also you bring in more and more actors and agents. Suddenly you have a multiplication of agents, and probably that model that we developed in the late 50s and 60s of thinking the Arctic as a site where we can engage somehow in game theory, where our knowledge production needs to be matched with the knowledge of the situation of the other, so that we constantly engage with that possibility of somehow the second strike. Escalation means that you can always do worse. What you're doing is not the end. You can always escalate. It brings us. You can improve somehow, and the very notion of improvement is so difficult to tackle in the aftermath of the Cold War, which is exactly what we are experiencing in the Arctic, I would suggest. And that's why what I would like to ask Marianne, how do you see that particular aftermath of the Cold War in Norway? Because, of course, Norway has played a crucial role in those 60 years, but in a completely different alignment.
But I think that the situation in the Barents region is, of course, a radical change the past 20 years. One example is that the infrastructure is quite bad, and there should have been a train connection between Kirkenes and Murmansk, for instance, but that was rejected because of military interests during the Cold War. And now we try to increase the connections and the infrastructure, and we see that there is like you said, we both Russia and Norway gave up interests in trying to get this new border on the map, and I think both sides see we have to cooperate and we have common interests. So I think the situation has radically changed, of course.
Does that influence, for instance, your prospective project in Tromsø?
Yeah, because you have to work, cross the borders.
Are you taking on board Russian partners?
I don't know yet too much about the Oslo plans, but of course in the region we try to cooperate in many different levels. So I worked with the European competition, and we try to get Russia in through Murmansk. So it's a gateway in a way to.
And do you see that culture is particularly welcome in those situations? Because you're dealing European, a difficult setup because it's an international organization. And I remember talking quite recently with Knut Erik Dahl about it, and how difficult it is even to organize competitions for young architects that step out of the national system.
Yeah.
But is culture, let's say, always operating like that in your experience? Cultural institutions are always operating like that are entrenched in the national? Or do you have models that you could indicate as good examples of somehow stepping out?
Yeah, I think that the Barents cooperation is a good example also in cultural matters. And there is a drive force in Kirkenes, Pikene på broen. Some artists, you understand, and they, and they work really hard to overcome these borders, and maybe it's also quite interesting to mention that in Kirkenes, it's the city on the northwest of Norway. You have all the street signs, both in Norwegian and Russian. But at the same time now there has been a huge discussion in Tromsø because the Sami people wants to have Sami street names in the streets of Tromsø, but now the mayor has said no, that's out of question. So of course there's tensions between the indigenous and the Norwegians, if you could say that, even if it's mixed up. I think even I am a mixed up indigenous and Norwegian. And also internationally between the Russian and the Norwegians. I mean, you have Nikkel, one of the most polluted areas in the world, very close to the Norwegian border, and you have a huge gap between, also economically. So it's, I mean, it's not only difficult, the interests related to resources, but also the differences in culture and economic situation.
And different languages, different,
yeah.
Not only different versions of similar languages, but radically different languages and different ways of even conceiving space. And that's why I wanted then maybe to bring in a little bit Jen's point of view. How do you see then possibility now that you are somehow stepping also out of the institutions, of constantly having to negotiate your position? Can you tell us more? Is this just a fictitious project, or is it something that you would consider somehow a line of set up a practice? How does it operate for you? Can you tell us more? Because some of your colleagues are in a similar situation now. No, they are about to graduate.
How to? I mean, if I can answer, then I set it up. But of course, eventually that is a goal. I think the difficulty is if we come back to the north, and I'm a foreign here, coming from outside of Europe. I come to here to absorb myself in the knowledge production processes, which has been developed centuries. And the difficulty is, as well as for the north, if you, as Philippe said, it's a repeating of the colonialization system, because for the North, if you tend to think it as empty, it's just a repeating colonization to think the other big part of the land is empty. But the awareness of the local people is unlike 100 years ago. Now the difficulty is if you think other areas empty, it's very, very likely to trigger the resistance from the local area. And once you trigger the resistance from local area, there's no way you can engage. So what I try to say is, for example, if you try to engage with land like Greenland, then they will be super resistant and then to protect their identity. And but when they protect their identity, they are creating a funny image of reinventing themselves as exotic, which impossible then to produce knowledge. And then, so maybe it's a disaster. But so you can see this kind of situation in China where they build old Chinese style building and try to claim that it's identity, so you won't be quite surprised to see in Greenland they build a super big igloo kind of architecture, and which is not allowed knowledge production. So while maybe 80% of the architecture are building outside of this area, as where I'm studying. So the question is, I don't know, I mean, but the question will be, in a good way, will be how to set up the diversity of the knowledge production of the world, or there will be a new battle of the conflicts of the knowledge production throughout the world. And that's my answer now.
That's scary. Do we have questions? I would like to open it up, of course, to the floor.
I fully agree.
Are there initial questions? No. Final questions?
I would like more information, in part because I come from Canada, and my understanding is that in two things. First of all, the Aboriginal peoples, the First Nations peoples who are not living in the north have not succeeded in terms of their kind of political project of self-determination to the same extent as the Inuit and the Dene. And part of that has always been argued is a consequence precisely of remoteness, that the geography produced a political project in the north that it didn't succeed in the south, which had was much too kind of, it's contaminated, if you will, and much too entangled with the southern social networks and urbanization projects, etc. So there, so that's just a kind of comment that the remoteness actually is always argued as that which produced a much more successful, if you will, project moving towards self-determination and sovereignty on the part of Aboriginal people in the north. And I guess one of my questions, I'm very interested because most of Canada is under land claim dispute, including northern regions, and that's certainly a kind of ongoing legal provocation to questions of sovereignty in the north. And I'm wondering, I guess I'm directing this to you, Philippe, in terms of how, to what extent are land claims disputes being actually factored into the sort of larger institutional frameworks that are trying to grapple with questions of sovereignty?
I'm not a specialist of this, especially, and I have been working on very specific local communities in Canada, but there is, this is what I was starting to do, to say something and I forgot to finish this. So this is the occasion to highlight the very, how do you say, paradoxal or schizophrenic way a state is working, because in these discussions with the local community or first people or indigenous, there is many actually way to define those populations, and none of them are really of a coincidence, and some of them can be very pejorative. And we in France, we never know. Indigenous is extremely insulting in French, which is not in English, for example. So it's already this is very difficult. Aboriginal people, how do you define them, and what's the difference between Aboriginal and Inuit? Who are them? Are they local communities? Are they? But this is about each other's interests, and the big debate. I don't know. We have no answer to this. When there is discussions, when there is a large industrial project or a large dam project, or something which is going to harm or to transform deeply the environment, where a local community, whoever it is living, to what do you give the favoritism? Do you give it to, does it have to serve the nation as itself? So you can imagine that if you build a large dam to produce electricity, it will be spread nationally, it's clean, it's renewable energy, but in the same time maybe it will harm the way a local community organizes its network and the way to live. And there is here the confrontation of two logic, two needs, and of course two set of interests. And this is very difficult to answer, because how could you be against production of clean energy, of renewable energy? In France, we have sacrificed many places, many local communities on the sake of serving the nation. All the hydroelectric, etc. Let's not speak about it, but at a smaller scale, but at a larger scale in Canada, this is what is happening. And this is why there is no national agreements on Canadians and local communities, let's call them like that. Just to bracket something was very funny, because I have followed the mission of the Ministry of Fisheries in Norway. There was a commission. There were 6 or 7 people, and they were traveling by car all along the coast in northern Norway, and they were stopping in each single village. And they arrived in this very small community, 20 persons, west of Tana, and you had there the 3 best specialists on fisheries that you can find in Norway, professors of university. And they started to speak, and they didn't know suddenly how to speak about the Sami. They said, well, we are going to speak about the problems which occurs between Norwegian and if they would say Sami, they would mean that Sami were not Norwegians, but they are not Norwegian nationals. And they didn't know, and they said Norwegian and others. And suddenly that was the others. But the others is the foreigners. Here we have British and others. In France there is others, and we know what it means. And this was, I have received it very strongly. It was just in a small chapel up northern Norway by minus 25 degrees in winter. And they really made this effort, and they couldn't find a way to, and in my opinion, this is in the heart of the problem. When you are unable to define a local group or local communities as a citizen of a country. After all, you have a country, there are citizens, they have citizenships, and every human beings, whoever they are, black, white, yellow, whatever, they have the same rights according to the constitutions of the country where they are living. Full stop. And but the community themselves claim to have a right, a specific right on the territories they are actually living on since hundreds of years. And there is a really huge fundamental paradox. This is some kind of a complexity that we have to map, that we have to first understand. How does it work? What's the interest between this and the nation? I have no answer, and I have very mixed feelings about that. About when you are a nation, when you're a country, who do you serve first, and at what level you have to respect the local community, etc. Of course, in Norway has been also acting very badly, very brutally against the Sami community by the past, and the Sami community recall it each time it's necessary. The French has been acting very badly against the people in the colonized country, as well as all colonizers. And of course, considering the local communities of autochtone or the indigenous people as not really being human beings was not because they didn't want to recognize them as human beings, because it was just serving economic interest to exploit the environment and the resources. So this is what I could say. And in Canada, the debate is a daily debate, as you may know, because each time there is a project, it enters in the big discussions. But as I said, even though there is no real agreement between, even in the Nunavut, which is actually the most achieved agreement you can find in Canada, and speaking about other local communities, the agreements are made day by day, drop by drop. You have a project and then you discuss, but there is no global agreement like you can find in Scandinavia. But I have the impression that this gives much more power to the local community or indigenous people in Canada.
But there's a huge difference percentages. In Arctic Canada, it's almost 70% indigenous, or how you define it, and in northern part of Norway, it's only 1.4. So relating to a democratic question is quite different.
So, are there more questions, or maybe we can conclude? We had quite a long day discussing the initial steps, I think, of a project to see the multilateral construction of images in the North. So the untamed nature of the North is probably the first part that will collapse as an image in our minds as we go away from here. I think this is already a good step to understand our relation to nature in that sense. Then we discussed how that process of construction could be considered architecture, and maybe then could also consider geography or institution building. And this creates then, of course, an internal issue of colonial issue of naming things in different way, and that leaves it somehow again at odds with a conceptualization of change, conceptualization of transformation. And I think probably what we are perceiving is really a situation where the distinction between different polities and their spaces of operation is becoming more and more entrenched one with the other. And that's the initial step, I guess, that we can take with us after this very intense evening. So I would like to thank you very much, Philippe Rekacewicz, for having joined us this evening, Marianne Skjulhaug and Chen, with remotely the contribution of Armin Linke and somehow the presence of Stuart Franklin that couldn't make it this evening from Magnum Photos, and he wanted to excuse himself for that. Thank you very much also to the students of Dip4 for having set up this multilateral points of view on our discussion, and all our friends and colleagues that have joined us so kindly this evening. And I wish you a very nice evening tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.